At 0832 on the morning of October 14, 1943, American bomber crews stationed across eastern England were getting ready for a mission that would become one of the deadliest days in the history of the United States Army Air Forces. The morning atmosphere was cold and clammy. Fog had covered the airfields throughout eastern England overnight. Ground crews had been at work since 0400 hours, refueling aircraft, loading bombs, and inspecting engines. The odor of aviation fuel lingered thickly in the pre-dawn gloom. From dozens of airfields across East Anglia, 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses were firing up their engines. The roar rolled across the countryside. Crews boarded their aircraft. Pilots went through their checklists. Co-pilots confirmed instrument readings. Bombardiers inspected their bomb loads. Gunners test-fired their guns. Radio operators adjusted their frequencies. The routine was well known. The anxiety was not. Most of these men understood they were flying straight into a death trap. The 351st Bomb Group at Royal Air Force Polbrook was part of the enormous force assembling that morning. 41 B-17s from the group were preparing for the mission. The crews had been briefed at 0500 hours. When the intelligence officer drew back the curtain, revealing the red ribbon stretching deep into Germany toward Schweinfurt, the room filled with groans. Everyone knew what Schweinfurt represented. The 8th Air Force had attacked these targets 2 months earlier on August 17. That mission had cost 60 bombers and 600 men, the highest loss rate of any operation to that point. Now they were going back. The briefing officer explained the reasoning once more. Schweinfurt produced more than 40% of Germany's ball bearings. These were vital components for virtually every piece of military equipment. Destroy the factories and German war production would be crippled. The target was crucial. The mission was essential. The expected cost would be severe. For the previous 5 months, bomber crews flying from England into Germany had faced steadily increasing resistance. Empty bunks appeared in the Nissen huts with unsettling frequency. Crews that flew out in the morning sometimes failed to return by evening. Personal belongings were collected and sent home. Letters arrived from families asking about sons and brothers who would never reply. The numbers were merciless. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force calculated that bomber crews had only a 35% chance of surviving their required 25 missions. 2 out of every 3 men would become casualties. Every crew member knew these figures. They lived with them daily. The target was Schweinfurt, Germany. Ball-bearing factories deep inside German territory, 390 miles from the English coast. More than 6 hours in the air, the city contains several ball-bearing plants operated by Varianite Kugeliger Fabriken, known as VKF, and Fichtel and Sachs. Together, these facilities produced an estimated 42% of Germany's total ball-bearing output. Ball bearings were indispensable components in nearly every type of military equipment. Tanks required them for turret rotation and track systems. Aircraft depended on them for propellers, landing gear, and engine accessories. Submarines used them for periscopes and torpedo tubes. Artillery relied on them for traversing mechanisms. Trucks needed them for wheels and drivetrains. Without ball bearings, German war production would grind to a standstill. The issue was not the importance of the target. The issue was getting there and returning alive. The mission plan was straightforward and unforgiving. American P-47 Thunderbolts would escort the bombers to the German border, perhaps 50 miles beyond it. Then their fuel would be exhausted and they would have to turn back. After that, the bombers would be on their own for roughly 3 hours, penetrating 200 miles deeper into Germany to reach the target. The bomb run over Schweinfurt would be followed by another 200 miles back out until fresh P-47s could rendezvous near the border for the final leg home. 3 hours without fighter cover. 3 hours during which German fighters would have unrestricted access to attack the bomber formations. Alone meant facing Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s without friendly fighters to drive them away. Alone meant the Luftwaffe could organize mass assaults, refuel and rearm at forward airfields, then strike again. Alone meant watching bombers explode and fall with no way to help them. Alone meant dying. The 8th Air Force had attempted this very mission before. On August 17, 1943, exactly 2 months earlier, they launched what became known as the Double Strike mission. The plan looked brilliant on paper: hit 2 critical targets at the same time to divide German fighter defenses. 376 B-17s would take off. 146 bombers from the 3rd Bombardment Division under Colonel Curtis LeMay would strike the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, then continue south to land at bases in North Africa. This would be the first American shuttle bombing mission. 230 bombers from the 1st Bombardment Division under Brigadier General Robert Williams would attack the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and return to England. The concept was sound. If both forces entered German airspace at nearly the same time, the Luftwaffe would be forced to split its fighters. Neither target would face the full weight of German air defenses. But the mission unraveled from the beginning. Dense fog covered the airfields where the Schweinfurt force was based. Visibility dropped to less than a quarter mile. Bombers could not see to taxi, let alone take off in formation. The mission was delayed. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. The Regensburg force, operating from different airfields where fog was lighter, took off on schedule and crossed into German airspace by mid-morning. German radar detected them immediately. Every available Luftwaffe fighter unit in occupied Europe was scrambled. The Germans threw everything they had at the Regensburg force. Hundreds of fighters attacked in waves, but LeMay pressed on. His bombers fought through the defenses, bombed the target, and continued south toward Africa. They had completed their task. By the time the Schweinfurt force finally became airborne and reached German territory in the early afternoon, everything had changed. The German fighters that had attacked the Regensburg mission had already landed at forward airfields. Ground crews worked frantically. Aircraft were refueled in 15 minutes, rearmed in another 10. Fresh pilots replaced exhausted ones. Mechanics patched bullet holes and swapped damaged parts. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the Schweinfurt bombers crossed into German airspace, waves of German fighters were waiting for them, rested, rearmed, and ready. The element of surprise was gone. The divided defenses never materialized. The Schweinfurt force faced nearly the full strength of the Luftwaffe. The assaults were savage and coordinated. Messerschmitt 109s attacked head-on in groups of 4 or 5 aircraft. They flew straight at the bomber formations at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. They held their fire until they were within 300 yards. Then they unleashed everything. For 20mm cannons and multiple machine guns firing at once. The combined firepower at that distance could tear AB-17 apart. German pilots knew head-on attacks gave bomber gunners only 2 or 3 seconds to aim before the fighters streaked past. The tactic was nearly suicidal but devastatingly effective. Focke-Wulf 190s attacked from the sides and rear, focusing their fire on engines. German pilots deliberately targeted the outboard engines. If both engines on one wing were disabled, the bomber could not hold altitude or remain with the formation. Physics took over. An asymmetric bomber with 2 engines on one wing and none on the other could not fly level. It would roll, spin, and plunge. A damaged bomber falling behind the formation was finished. Other fighters would descend on it like wolves on a wounded animal, striking from every direction until it went down. The slaughter went on for hours. 60 bombers were lost that day, 24 from the Regensburg force, 36 from the Schweinfurt force, 600 men. Some died instantly when their aircraft exploded, torn apart by cannon shells hitting fuel tanks or bomb bays. Some burned to death as crippled bombers fell in flames, trapped in aircraft that became flying coffins. Some bailed out successfully, but were captured immediately upon landing, spending the rest of the war in prisoner camps. Some died from wounds during the long trip to those camps, bleeding out in the back of trucks on rough roads. Some fell when their parachutes failed or were shredded by shrapnel. Some drowned when they came down in the North Sea, and rescue never arrived, freezing in the water while waiting for help that never came. The survivors came back to their bases in England that evening and told intelligence officers the same thing. We need fighter escorts all the way to the target and back. We need protection for the entire mission. Without escorts deep into Germany, we are being slaughtered. The intelligence officers documented every statement. They recorded the details of every attack. They compiled lists of missing crews, group commanders, wrote detailed reports. The reports went up the chain to 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe. The conclusion was unavoidable and brutal. Daylight strategic bombing without long-range fighter escort was failing catastrophically, but there were no long-range fighters. That was the fundamental problem that was killing American bomber crews every single day over Germany. The technology simply did not exist in service with the 8th Air Force in mid-1943. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was an excellent fighter aircraft, one of the best in the world at high altitude. It was fast in a dive, reaching speeds over 500 miles per hour. It was heavily armed with 850 caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, that could destroy any German fighter with a concentrated burst. It was incredibly tough, built around a massive Pratt & Whitney 18-cylinder radial engine that could absorb 20mm cannon hits and keep running. It had self-sealing fuel tanks that could take multiple bullet hits without leaking. It had armor plate protecting the pilot from ground fire in fighter attacks. American pilots loved the Thunderbolt. They called it the Jug because its stubby fuselage looked like a milk jug. With wings, in combat, it could outrun German fighters in a dive, absorb damage that would destroy lighter aircraft, and deliver devastating firepower. But the P-47 had one fatal weakness that no amount of pilot skill or courage could overcome: range. With only internal fuel tanks, it had a combat radius of approximately 225 miles. It could fly that far, fight for perhaps 15 minutes, and return to base with minimum fuel reserves. That was barely enough to reach the French coast. It was nowhere near enough to escort bombers deep into Germany. Engineers had developed external drop tanks that could be mounted under the wings. These disposable tanks carried additional fuel that could be jettisoned when empty or when entering combat. With drop tanks, the P-47's range increased to over 450 mi. This was a significant improvement. But it still was not enough. Schweinfurt was 390 miles from England, Berlin was 560 miles, Munich was even further. The P-47 simply could not fly that far, fight and return. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning theoretically had better range. With drop tanks, it could fly over 450 miles on paper. The twin-engine design meant more fuel capacity built into the twin booms. It also provided the safety of having two engines for long over-water flights. If one engine failed, the pilot could fly home on the other. On paper, the P-38 looked like the perfect solution to the escort problem, but it had catastrophic problems at the altitudes where combat occurred over Germany. Above 25,000 feet, the P-38 became nearly unflyable. The engines would quit without warning, spark plugs would foul in the extreme cold, the supercharger intercoolers would ice up, causing sudden engine failures that could not be corrected. The control cables that ran through the twin booms to the tail would contract and sometimes freeze, making the aircraft nearly uncontrollable. Pilots reported that trying to fly combat in a P-38 above 25,000 feet was not just difficult but extremely dangerous, since German fighters operated routinely at 30,000 feet and often attacked from even higher altitudes. This made the P-38 vulnerable and nearly useless for high-altitude bomber escort over Germany. The aircraft worked beautifully at lower altitudes. Most P-38 squadrons were reassigned to the Mediterranean and Pacific theaters, where they could operate at 15 to 20,000 feet with great success. In those theaters, the P-38 became one of the most effective fighters of the war. The British Royal Air Force had tried daylight bombing early in the war and learned through bitter experience that unescorted bombers suffered catastrophic losses. German fighters tore them apart. The RAF switched to night bombing by 1941. Darkness provided protection that fighters could not. The Americans, however, believed they had developed a solution to the daylight bombing problem. Their doctrine said that heavily armed bombers flying in tight combat box formations could defend themselves through mass defensive firepower. Each B-17 Flying Fortress had 1350 caliber Browning machine guns, 2 in the chin turret under the nose, 2 in the powered dorsal turret on top of the fuselage, 2 in the ball turret underneath, 2 in the tail turret, 1 flexible gun in the radio room position, 2 guns at the waist positions on each side of the fuselage, 2 guns in the nose operated by the bombardier and navigator. That was formidable firepower. 13 guns per aircraft, each capable of firing 800 rounds per minute. That was 10,400 rounds per minute from a single bomber. A standard combat box formation consisted of 18 bombers arranged in staggered layers. High squadron flying above, lead squadron in the middle, low squadron below, 6 aircraft in each squadron positioned so their defensive fields of fire. The theory was mathematically elegant. A German fighter attacking this formation would face fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. 18 bombers meant 234 guns total. The combined firepower should be sufficient to drive off or destroy any attacking fighters. American planners ran the calculations and concluded that the self-defending bomber formation was viable. The B-17 could fight its way to any target in Germany and fight its way back. The reality over Germany in 1943 proved this doctrine catastrophically and bloodily wrong. German fighter pilots were experienced, well-trained, and innovative. They had been fighting continuously since 1939. 4 years of constant combat. They had learned from fighting the Royal Air Force in the Battle of Britain. They had learned from fighting on the Eastern Front against the Soviets. They had studied American tactics and formations. They knew exactly how to attack B-17 formations to minimize their exposure to defensive fire while maximizing damage to the bombers. First, the Luftwaffe identified precisely where the B-17's defensive fire was weakest. The nose had only 2 flexible guns operated by the Bombardier and Navigator. These men were not trained gunners. Their primary jobs were navigation and bomb aiming. The guns were secondary weapons they operated when necessary. Attacks from 12 o'clock high, directly head-on and slightly above, gave those gunners perhaps 3 seconds to track a target and fire before the fighters closed to point blank range and flashed past at combined closing speeds exceeding 530 miles per hour. At that speed, even experienced gunners had almost no time to properly lead the target. The Bombardier and Navigator had virtually no chance. Second, German fighters attacked in formations rather than individually. 42-8 fighters would approach in line astern, flying nose-to-tail. Only the lead fighter faced the full concentration of defensive fire from the bomber formation. The trailing fighters could aim at bombers that were already damaged or distracted by defending against the lead fighter. This tactic multiplied the effectiveness of each attack pass. By the time bomber gunners tracked and fired at the lead fighter, the second and third fighters were already firing. The formation attack overwhelmed defensive fire. Third, the Luftwaffe developed specialized bomber destroyer units called Sturmgruppen. These assault groups used Faller-Wolf 190 fighters that had been heavily modified. Extra armor plating protected the cockpit and engine. The standard 20 mm cannons were replaced with devastating 30 mm cannons. These weapons fired explosive shells that could destroy a B-17 with just 3 hits. The heavily armored fighters would close to point-blank range, sometimes within 50 yards of the bombers. They would absorb defensive fire that would destroy normal fighters. Then they would open fire with the 30 mm cannons at ranges where they could not miss. The results were catastrophic for the bombers. Fourth, German fighters learned to identify and systematically target damaged bombers. If a bomber had an engine smoking or feathered with its propeller stopped, if it was falling behind the formation, if it showed any sign of being crippled, the Luftwaffe would concentrate multiple fighters on it. A straggler had no chance. Once a bomber fell out of formation, it lost the overlapping protective fire from the other bombers. German fighters would attack it from multiple angles simultaneously until it went down. This tactic was brutally efficient. By October 1943, the numbers told a grim story. Bomber crews faced impossible odds. The 8th Air Force calculated survival statistics, and the results were devastating. 2 out of 3 men would become casualties before completing their required 25 missions. These were not abstract statistics. These were fathers and sons. These were brothers and husbands. These were young men who had volunteered to serve their country and were dying in the skies over Germany at unsustainable rates. On the morning of October 14, 1943, 291 B-17s took off from bases across eastern England. The force assembled over the English Channel and set course for Germany, climbing to 25,000 feet at that altitude. Temperatures dropped to -40°F. The crews wore heated suits, but the cold still penetrated. Oxygen masks froze. Moisture from breath turned to ice. When men were wounded later in the mission, their blood froze before it could be properly bandaged. The first friendly fighters appeared over Holland. 74 P-47 Thunderbolt spread around the bomber formation in a protective screen. The fighter pilots knew they would stay As long as fuel lasted. Not as long as the bombers needed protection. As long as fuel lasted. The formation crossed into German airspace at 10:40. Radar stations tracked them immediately. Luftwaffe fighter units across Germany scrambled. Ground controllers vetoed fighters to intercept positions. The trap was being set. At 1,100 hours, the P-47s waggled their wings in salute and turned west toward England. Their fuel was running low. They had no choice but to leave. Within minutes, they were gone. The bombers were alone, deep in German airspace, defenseless except for their own guns. The Luftwaffe knew the Americans were unescorted. They had been tracking the formation since it crossed the coast. Now the killing would begin. At 11:13, the first wave of German fighters attacked Mehmed 109s, diving from 30,000 feet in tight formations of 4 aircraft, head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high. The classic frontal assault. They closed to 300 yards before firing. Orange traces arced toward the formation. 20mm cannon shells flashed and sparkled as they hit. The fighters fired for perhaps 2 seconds, then broke away, rolling inverted and diving under the bombers to avoid collision. The first B-7 went down at 11:15. Ahmed's cannon shells hit the number 2 engine on the left wing. The engine exploded in a ball of fire. Flames spread along the wing. The wing structure weakened. The wing snapped off at the rout. The bomber rolled inverted and spun down, tumbling end over end. Crewmen tried to bail out, but the G forces pinned them inside. 4 parachutes opened. 6 men went down with the aircraft. The attacks continued in waves. One formation of mess would attack from the front before the bomber gunners could recover. Another formation would attack from the side, then another from above. The coordination was perfect. The Luftwaffe had practiced these tactics for months. They knew exactly what they were doing. More bombers fell. Some exploded instantly when cannon shells hit bomb bays filled with high explosives. Some caught fire and slowly fell from formation, leaving trails of black smoke. Some simply broke apart in midair from structural damage. The sky filled with falling debris and parachutes. The bomber formations tightened to cover gaps left by fallen aircraft. This was standard procedure. Close the formation. Maintain the defensive box. Keep the fields of fire overlapping, but every bomber that fell created a gap that had to be filled. Aircraft had to maneuver to fill those gaps. This made them vulnerable. German fighters concentrated on aircraft that maneuvered out of position. Gunners fired until their gun barrels glowed red hot. Shell casings piled up inside the aircraft. The air inside the bombers was freezing despite the gun heat. Men fought in temperatures 40 degrees below zero. The attacks were relentless. Wave after wave of German fighters. The Luftwaffe had committed everything to stopping this raid. Over 200 fighters from multiple units engaged. The bomber stream. Mehmed 109s, Fowler-Wolf 190s, twin-engine Mehmed 110s. Firing rockets from beyond the range of defensive fire. The Germans used every tactic they had developed. Frontal attacks, beam attacks, attacks from above and below, rocket attacks from long range. The bomber crews fought back desperately, but they were outnumbered and outmatched. 14:40, after 3 hours of running battles, the surviving bombers reached Schweinfurt, the target, the reason for this nightmare mission. The flak was intense. German 88mm anti-aircraft guns surrounded the city. Black puffs of exploding shells filled the sky. Each puff was a deadly sphere of shrapnel. The fragments could tear through aluminum skin like tissue paper. The bombers had to fly straight and level on the bomb run. No evasive maneuvers allowed. The Norden bomb site required stable flight for accurate bombing. For 3 minutes, the bombers held course while German gunners below shot at them. Anti-aircraft shells exploded all around them. Shrapnel tore through fuselages and wings. More aircraft were hit. More men died. Then the bombs dropped. The aircraft lurched upward as tons of high explosives fell away. Below them, Schweinfurt burned. Massive explosions rippled through the ball bearing. Factories. Secondary explosions followed as stored materials ignited. Smoke rose. Thousands of feet. The target was hit. The mission objective was achieved. Now, they had to survive the flight home. Between Schweinfurt and the German border, more B-17s went down. The Luftwaffe continued attacking. They focused on damaged aircraft. Bombers with engines out. Bombers trailing. Smoke. Bombers falling behind. The German fighters showed no mercy. They attacked until their ammunition ran out. Then they landed, rearmed, and attacked again. Some Luftwaffe pilots flew 3 or 4 combat sorties that day against the same bomber stream. At 1540, P-47 Thunderbolts appeared diving from altitude. The escort fighters had launched from England and met the bombers as far east as fuel allowed. German fighters immediately broke off attacks when they saw the Thunderbolts. With fighter escort, even partial escort, the odds shifted dramatically. The Thunderbolts drove off the remaining German fighters. They escorted the battered bomber formations back toward England. Some bombers with battle damage could not keep up. They fell behind and went down within sight of the coast. So close to home, but not close enough. By 1745, the surviving bombers began landing at their bases across England. Crews climbed out of their aircraft, exhausted and traumatized. Some aircraft had dead crew members still aboard. Some had wounded men who had bled through the flight home. Maintenance crews counted the battle damage. Hundreds of bullet holes, shrapnel damage, destroyed engines, shattered gun positions. Across England, 291 B-17s had taken off that morning. 60 did not return. Another 17 were damaged so badly they were scrapped, rather than repaired. Total loss was 77 aircraft. 26% of the attacking force. 650 men were casualties, dead, wounded, or missing. The mission was immediately nicknamed Black Thursday. It was the highest single mission loss the 8th Air Force would suffer in the entire war. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt had been hit hard. German production reports documented that output dropped 34% immediately after the raid. But those same reports showed something troubling. Germany had stockpiled ball bearings for months. They had sufficient reserves to make up the production shortfall. Albert Speer, the German Minister of Armaments, later reported that within weeks production was back to acceptable levels. Imports from neutral Sweden and Switzerland helped fill gaps. The strategic impact of the raid was far less than planners had hoped. The cost in men and aircraft was devastating. The results were minimal. General Ika, commanding the 8th Air Force, knew the truth that the statistics made brutally clear. Daylight strategic bombing without long-range fighter escort was failing, not because bomber crews lacked courage. They had proven their courage beyond any doubt. Not because the B-7 was inadequate. The Flying Fortress was a magnificent aircraft, but because unescorted bombers deep inside Germany were dying at rates the Air Force could not sustain. August 17, 60 bombers lost. October 14, 60 more lost. Every deep penetration raid cost 15 to 25% of the attacking force. At that rate, the 8th Air Force would be destroyed before it could destroy Germany's war industries. The problem was fundamentally one of range. American fighter pilots were among the best trained in the world. Their aircraft were highly capable, but neither the P-47 Thunderbolt nor the P-38 Lightning could escort bombers to targets deep inside Germany. The bombers desperately needed a fighter that could fly 500M, fight for 30 minutes, and fly 500M back. In October 1943, that aircraft existed but was not yet in service with the 8th Air Force in significant numbers. The story of how that aircraft came to be is one of the most important developments of the entire war. In early 1942, the British Royal Air Force desperately needed modern fighter aircraft. Britain was fighting for survival. German U-boat were sinking cargo ships faster than they could be replaced. The RAF needed fighters, but British factories could barely keep up with demand. The British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation in California with a Straightforward request. Could North American build Curtiss P-40 Warhawk fighters under license? The P-40 was an adequate fighter, but it had significant limitations in performance and capability. It was what the British could get. North American Aviation's President James Kindleberger made a bold counteroffer that changed history. Instead of building P-40s, North American would design and build a completely new fighter specifically to British requirements. An aircraft superior to anything currently flying. Better yet, they would have a prototype flying in 120 days. The British were deeply skeptical. Designing a new fighter normally took years. North American was promising to do it in 4 months, but Britain was desperate enough to take the chance. They agreed. North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmud, assembled a team of engineers and went to work. Schmud was a German immigrant who had come to America via Brazil. He understood aerodynamics at a fundamental level. He had studied wing designs for years. He designed the new fighter around a revolutionary Laminina flow wing that reduced drag significantly compared to conventional wings. The wing was thicker in the middle and thinner at the edges. Air flowed over it with minimal turbulence. This reduced drag and increased speed. He positioned the radiator under the fuselage in a carefully designed scoop. Hot air from the radiator actually accelerated through the scoop, creating thrust rather than drag. Every detail was optimized. The prototype rolled out in 102 days, just over 3 months from contract signing to completed aircraft. It flew on October 26, 1940. The flight test results exceeded every performance specification the British had requested. The new fighter was faster than expected. It was more maneuverable than expected. It had longer range than fighter expected. North American had delivered exactly what they promised, but there was one critical problem that threatened to make the new fighter useless for the one mission that mattered most. The prototype used an Allison V1710 inline engine. The Allison was a good engine at low altitude. It produced over 1,000 horsepower at sea level, but above 15,000 feet, its performance dropped dramatically. The single-stage supercharger could not maintain power at altitude at 25,000 feet where bomber escort combat occurred over Germany. The new fighter was dangerously underpowered. It could not compete with German fighters at that altitude. It could not protect bombers. The Royal Air Force accepted delivery of the new fighter anyway. They used it for low-altitude reconnaissance missions and ground attack. The fighter performed excellently in those roles. It was fast. It was maneuverable. It had long range. Pilots loved flying it. But it was unsuitable for high-altitude bomber escort, which was what the 8th Air Force needed most desperately. In April 1942, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker flew the new fighter at the Rolls-Royce facility in Hucknall, England. Harker had extensive experience testing the Spitfire. He understood high-altitude fighter performance better than almost anyone. He flew the new fighter and immediately recognized both its extraordinary potential and its critical weakness. After landing, he wrote a detailed technical report to Rolls-Royce management and the British Air Ministry. His recommendation was direct and unambiguous. Install a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine in the new fighter. The Merlin was the engine that powered the legendary Spitfire. It was one of the finest piston engines ever designed. It had a sophisticated two-stage two-speed supercharger specifically designed for high-altitude performance. At 30,000 feet, the Merlin produced nearly as much power as it did at sea level. The supercharger compressed thin high-altitude air to maintain engine power. Put a Merlin in the new fighter's airframe and the result would be an aircraft with long range, high speed, excellent maneuverability, and high-altitude performance. Everything the 8th Air Force needed. Harker's report was perhaps the single most consequential piece of technical analysis written during the entire war. It identified the exact solution to the problem that was killing bomber crews over Germany. Rolls-Royce engineers immediately began testing the concept. They pulled a Merlin 61 engine from a Spitfire production line and installed it in one of the new fighter airframes. The installation required significant modifications, but the basic concept worked perfectly. The first flight of the Merlin-powered fighter took place in October 1942. The results exceeded even the most optimistic predictions. The Merlin-powered fighter could fly at 440 mph at Proidings, 30,000 feet. That was as faster than any fighter in the world at that altitude. It could climb to 20,000 feet in just over 7 minutes. German fighters took 10 to 12 minutes. It was highly maneuverable at altitude. German pilots would later report that it could turn inside a Messerschmitt 109. And, most importantly, with external drop tanks, it had a combat radius exceeding 800 m. That meant it could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back, 560 miles each way, with enough fuel remaining to fight for 30 minutes over the target. The fighter that would change the air war over Europe was the North American P-51 Mustang. In the United States, North American Aviation and Packard Motor Company moved quickly to put the Merlin-powered Mustang into production. Packard was already building Merlin engines under license from Rolls-Royce for other aircraft. They adapted the Merlin to fit the Mustang airframe. The Army Air Forces ordered the P-51B model into full production in June 1943. 2 factories began building them as fast as possible, but production and delivery took time. Aircraft had to be built, test-flown, delivered to England. Pilots had to be trained on the new type. Maintenance crews had to learn new procedures. By November 1943, the first production P-51B models began arriving in England in significant numbers. The first unit to receive Mustangs was the 354th Fighter Group. The pilots were initially skeptical. Most had been flying P-47 Thunderbolts. The Thunderbolt was a massive aircraft, big, heavy, tough as a tank. Pilots trusted it. The Mustang looked fragile by comparison. It had a liquid-cooled engine instead of the Thunderbolt's air-cooled radial, 1 bullet in the cooling system, and the engine would overheat and fail. The Mustang looked like it would break if you looked at it wrong. But opinions changed the moment pilots flew the Mustang in combat. On December 1, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission, 16 P-51 Mustangs on a fighter sweep over France. They were looking for trouble. They found it quickly. A formation of Messed 109s was patrolling north of Paris. The Mustangs attacked. Within 10 minutes, 3 German fighters were shot down. No Mustangs were lost. The German pilots tried every tactic they knew. They tried to turn with the Mustangs. The Mustangs turned inside them. They tried to climb away. The Mustangs climbed faster. They tried to dive away at maximum speed. The Mustangs followed them down and stayed with them. The German pilots could not escape. They could not fight effectively. They could only die or run. On December 5, the 354th flew its first bomber escort mission. 60 B-7 flying fortresses were attacking the port of Pikes, Nen, on the German coast. The Mustangs escorted them for the entire mission. 280 miles to the target. 280 miles back. When German fighters tried to attack the bombers, the Mustangs drove them off. The few German fighters that pressed attacks were shot down. Not a single bomber was lost to enemy fighters. The bomber crews could not believe it. For the first time, they had fighters that stayed with them for the entire mission. Word spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. There was a new fighter. It could go anywhere the bombers went. It could beat German fighters in any type of combat. Bomber crews began specifically requesting Mustang escort for missions. Fighter pilots wanted to transition to Mustangs. The demand was overwhelming. By January 1944, more P-51 groups were arriving in England. Production had ramped up dramatically. Factories were building Mustangs as fast as physically possible. Fighter group after fighter group converted from P-47s and P-38s to Mustangs. By spring 1944, 14 of the 15 fighter groups in the 8th Air Force flew P-51 Mustangs. The transformation was nearly complete. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang fundamentally changed everything about the air war over Europe. On March 4, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first major raid on Berlin, the German capital, the heart of the Nazi regime. 730 heavy bombers escorted by 800 fighters. Most of the fighters were P-51 Mustangs. This mission had been impossible just 3 months earlier. Berlin was 560 miles from England. No fighter could escort bombers that far and back. Now they could. The Mustangs escorted the bombers all the way to Berlin. They stayed over the target while the bombers made their runs. Then they escorted them all the way home. When German fighters attacked, which they did desperately, the Mustangs shot down 69 of them. The 8th Air Force lost 37 bombers. That was still heavy, but it was approximately half the loss rate of unescorted missions to similar targets. The difference was dramatic and undeniable. In January 1944, Lieutenant General James Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force. On January 6, Doolittle replaced General Ara Eaker as part of a command reorganization. Doolittle was a legendary pilot and a brilliant tactical thinker. He made one critical change to fighter doctrine that transformed how the air war would be fought. Previously, American fighters stayed close to the bomber formations in tight defensive escorts. Their primary mission was to protect the bombers from immediate attacks. If German fighters attacked and then dove away, the American fighters had to stay with the bombers. They could not pursue. Doolittle changed that completely. Under his new directive, American fighters were free to pursue German fighters anywhere, aggressively, relentlessly. If a messmate attacked a bomber formation and then dove away, Mustang pilots would chase it all the way to the ground. If German fighters tried to land at their bases to refuel and rearm, Mustangs would strafe them on their landing approaches. If German fighters were spotted on the ground, Mustangs would attack them there. The mission was no longer defensive protection. The mission was offensive air superiority. Find the Luftwaffe, destroy the Luftwaffe. Everywhere and anywhere. Doolittle later called this change the most important military decision he made during the entire war. It shifted the air war from defense to offense. This new tactical doctrine was fully implemented during Operation Argument, which became known as Big Week. Between February 20th and February 25, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched the most intensive strategic bombing campaign to that point in the war. The primary targets were German aircraft factories. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe's ability to build replacement fighters. Over 6 days, the 8th flew more than 3,800 heavy bomber sorties escorted by hundreds of fighters flying offensive sweeps. The Germans had no choice but to defend their aircraft factories. The Luftwaffe threw everything into battle, every available fighter unit, every experienced pilot. They fought desperately because they knew what was at stake. But the situation had changed fundamentally. American fighters were no longer tied defensively to bomber formations. Mustangs swept ahead of the bombers, hunting for German fighters before they could position for attacks. When German fighters did engage the bombers, Mustangs pursued them relentlessly. Luftwaffe pilots found themselves under attack while trying to land with empty guns and low fuel. Their own airfields became death traps. The 8th Air Force lost bombers during Big Week. 97 B-17s were shot down or crashed. 40 B-24s were lost. Another 20 bombers were so heavily damaged they were scrapped rather than repaired. Total heavy bomber losses reached 157 aircraft. These losses were deeply painful. Crews were killed, yet the losses remained within sustainable limits. More importantly, the rate of loss was falling sharply. Big Week missions averaged roughly 6% bomber losses. Compare that to the 20% loss rate at Schweinfurt just 4 months earlier. The difference was the arrival of the P-51 Mustang and the adoption of new offensive fighter tactics. The Germans suffered losses far beyond what they could afford. The Luftwaffe lost more than 262 fighters destroyed and another 90 damaged during the 6 days of Big Week. Even more devastating from the German viewpoint, nearly 100 experienced fighter pilots were killed. That represented about 14% of the entire German fighter force. These were pilots with years of combat experience, men who had fought in the Battle of Britain, over the Eastern Front, and in the Mediterranean. They were utterly irreplaceable. German pilot training had been drastically reduced because of chronic fuel shortages. New pilots arrived at frontline units with perhaps only 80 to 100 total flight hours. American pilots, by contrast, typically had 300 to 400 hours of training before entering combat. The experience gap was immense. Veteran German pilots were worth their weight in gold. They trained new pilots. They led formations. They made critical tactical decisions amid the chaos of combat. The Luftwaffe was losing these irreplaceable veterans faster than replacement was possible. Germany's best pilots were dying in the skies over their own homeland. The psychological effect on surviving Luftwaffe pilots was severe and steadily worsening. German fighter pilots who had been confident and aggressive in early 1943 grew cautious and demoralized by the spring of 1944. They knew they were outnumbered. They knew the American Mustang outperformed their Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s in nearly every category. They knew American pilots were better trained and more experienced. They understood that every mission might be their last. Morale collapsed. Between January and June 1944, the 8th Air Force flew more than 200,000 combat sorties and lost roughly 2,000 aircraft to all causes. During the same period, the Luftwaffe lost over 3,000 fighters and thousands of irreplaceable veteran pilots. The attrition was impossible to sustain. The Luftwaffe was being systematically dismantled as an effective fighting force. By June 6, 1944 D-Day, the results of this campaign were unmistakable. When Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, the Allies flew more than 14,000 air sorties in support of the invasion. The Germans managed approximately 300. German ground forces in Normandy pleaded desperately for air support throughout the day. None arrived. The Luftwaffe lacked the aircraft, fuel, and trained pilots needed to challenge Allied air supremacy. The few German aircraft that did appear were quickly shot down. The invasion moved forward under total Allied air dominance. On D-Day, the 8th Air Force's primary task was attacking Luftwaffe airfields across France and occupied territories to prevent any German air reinforcement of Normandy. American bombers and fighters destroyed more than 300 German aircraft on the ground that day. The small number of German aircraft that managed to fly toward Normandy were intercepted and destroyed before they could influence the invasion. The Luftwaffe had been rendered powerless. After D-Day, strategic bombing of Germany intensified dramatically. By then, bomber losses had dropped to levels that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Missions that routinely cost 30 or 40 bombers in 1943 now cost 3 or 4. The P-51 Mustang made that change possible. Long-range fighter escort gave bomber crews realistic chances of survival. By February 1945, the 8th Air Force was launching massive raids with more than 1,000 heavy bombers escorted by 500 Mustang fighters. The Germans could do almost nothing to stop them. The Luftwaffe committed its few remaining jet fighters to combat. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was genuinely fast and heavily armed with 430mm cannons, but too few were produced too late to alter the outcome. Mustang pilots learned to attack Me-262s during their vulnerable takeoff and landing phases, when the jets were slow and unable to exploit their speed advantage. Most German jets were destroyed on the ground by strafing attacks before they ever flew combat missions. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, the 8th Air Force had fulfilled every mission assigned to it. It had destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective military force. It had achieved complete air superiority over Germany. It had dropped more than 670,000 tons of bombs on German industrial and military targets. It had demolished oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants, reducing German fuel production to nearly nothing. It had shattered transportation networks, making the movement of troops and supplies nearly impossible. It had made the D-Day invasion possible by securing air superiority. It helped win the war, but the cost must never be forgotten or minimized. The 8th Air Force lost more than 26,000 men killed in action, more than the entire United States Marine Corps lost during the whole war across all theaters. Another 28,000 American airmen became prisoners of war. Over 4,700 heavy bombers were lost in combat, with thousands more damaged. These were not mere numbers, they were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. They were young men who volunteered to serve their country and paid the ultimate price. None of this would have been possible without long-range fighter escort. None of it would have been possible without the P-51 Mustang. That single aircraft changed the strategic situation fundamentally and permanently. The P-51 Mustang became the highest-scoring American fighter aircraft of the European War. Mustang pilots destroyed 4,950 enemy aircraft between late 1943 and May 1945, including both aerial victories and aircraft destroyed on the ground during strafing attacks. The Mustang flew more combat sorties than any other American fighter in the European theater. It escorted bombers to every major target in Germany. It flew deep penetration missions to Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Austria. It carried out complex shuttle missions in which bombers and fighters departed England, bombed targets in eastern Germany, flew to bases in the Soviet Union, and then attacked different targets on the return flight days later. The men who made the Mustang possible worked largely in obscurity and received little public recognition. Edgar Schmid designed one of the greatest fighter aircraft ever built. His innovative laminar flow wing and meticulous attention to aerodynamic efficiency produced an aircraft that was both fast and long-ranged. James Kindleberger made the bold decision to propose building an entirely new fighter rather than simply producing existing P-40 Warhawks under license. That choice brought the Mustang into existence. Ronald Harker authored the technical report recommending installation of the Merlin engine, transforming the Mustang from a capable low-altitude fighter into a war-winning high-altitude escort. These men, and many others, altered the course of the air war over Europe through technical innovation and decisive judgment. But the bomber crews understood best. Every man who flew deep penetration missions over Germany in 1944 and 1945 knew exactly what the Mustang meant. It meant a realistic chance to complete a required tour and return home alive. Before the Mustang arrived in large numbers, bomber crew survival was statistically unlikely. After it became the primary escort fighter, survival became not only possible but probable. That difference represented thousands of lives saved, thousands of men who returned to their families instead of dying over Germany, thousands who lived to raise children, pursue careers, and grow old. The 8th Air Force won the air war over Europe because its leaders recognized when existing doctrine was failing catastrophically and had the courage to seek better solutions. They acknowledged that unescorted bombers were being lost at unsustainable rates. They found an aircraft capable of escorting bombers anywhere in Germany. They shifted fighter tactics from defensive protection to offensive air superiority. They produced the Mustang in massive numbers. They trained pilots effectively. They applied overwhelming force to achieve total air dominance over the most heavily defended airspace in the world. By May 1945, the Luftwaffe was finished as an effective fighting force. The 8th Air Force had completed its strategic mission. Air superiority over Germany had been secured. The D-Day invasion had been enabled. German industry and transportation had been systematically destroyed. The mission was complete, accomplished at enormous cost in lives and aircraft, but accomplished. These stories matter. These men mattered. Thank you for listening.